Doctor Strange.
I always suspected this day would come.
Because you always suspected this day would come.
I'm ready.
On May 6th, nothing can prepare you for the mind-bending descent into madness.
This is the only way.
Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Rated PG-13. See it in premium large formats and IMAX.
Hello again, everybody. I'm Dr. Goodwin, clinical faculty here at the Billings Clinic in Montana, and I'm here with Nick Ifrady, the man, the myth, the legend.
Thank you, Dr. Goodwin. Hey, everyone. Nick Ifrady here. I am a student in a master's program for psychotherapy and counseling, future CMHC, and currently living in Billings as well, but in a different location as of right now. And overall, I think we both are this, we can qualify as such, journeymans of the soul.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So today we're going to talk about Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness and the psychology and symbolism and just kind of our whole take on that. It's the latest, I guess, from the MCU. We've got Doctor Strange in his sequel here. He is engaged in this quest to save this character who can traverse the multiverse. And as it turns out, there's this evil force chasing after this character named America, interestingly enough. And the story kind of follows the quest to save her from this dark entity. And we will be getting into heavy spoiler material, but I just thought I would start off with my overall thoughts on this film. In fact, I might as well just go ahead and let's just say spoiler warning right now, because I can't get into what I think about it without jumping right into the fact that this is a sequel to Doctor Strange, but it's, I think, even more so a sequel to WandaVision. However you feel about that. And because Wanda is the evil entity that's chasing after America and causes them to go on this multiverse adventure. But what are your initial thoughts about this movie?
We were talking about it earlier, and I think for me, I had a more positive reaction after we both saw it. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, retrospectively looking at it, it was because Sam Raimi directed it. I think that was a huge part of it for me. There was a little bit of nostalgia there in terms of him doing superhero movies,
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
And I just like his visual style. I feel like he builds up a lot of tension with his camera work and what he kind of gets out of his actors. So I really enjoyed that, and I think that was the biggest thing for me. And the second part of that was that I feel like it was one of the better Marvel films to come out recently, but it's still not on par with some of the other stuff that they've come out with in the last decade, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I initially came out of the theater with the feeling of, that was okay, kind of forgettable. I've since gotten a little bit more of a positive feeling about it, but only after thinking about it a lot and talking about it with some other folks. I think that one of the big strengths of the film is Sam Raimi's visual style. It's very kinetic without being chaotic. And now, I mean, let me just say right out here, when I'm talking about movies and I'm analyzing on my channel, let me just say this: I'm not a professional film critic, right? So I see things through the lens of psychiatry, through the lens of the psyche. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm an expert on film. I'm not Roger Ebert, right? So, but I have studied some on these subjects and storytelling in general, and so I kind of label myself as an educated layperson when it comes to this. That said, I felt like Sam Raimi was restrained in this. I get this sense that the studio was holding him back because there's some of that there, but then it just feels kind of muted and restrained. I don't know if you got that feeling too. What are your thoughts on that? Did you get that sense or not really?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, like I think we talked about this, but it was the most horror movie out of all the Marvel movies, like the horror elements that were kind of like scattered throughout. And I enjoyed that. But in terms of it being a sedated or muted version of what would typically be a Sam Raimi film was, when Wanda was kind of fighting off the Illuminati, right? Or Ultrons, the Ultrons, right? And she was covered in oil. I mean, that's pretty much blood, right? But it was oil, right? Yeah, I definitely got that. It was a Marvelified version of a Sam Raimi film.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of folks talking about how, like directors, for example, that have turned down Marvel projects because they get into it and they realize, that the studio says, don't worry about the effects. We're going to add all that stuff later and all that kind of thing. And what that means is essentially they're taking over the directorial duties for them. And they don't like that, So I'm actually kind of surprised that Raimi agreed to do this. But the feeling that you got from Spider-Man 2, right? The horror elements about the tentacles and getting into Dr. Octopus and all that stuff. There's a little bit of that spark here, but it's not to that degree. It's not that he has to go to a full-blown R rating into Evil Dead territory in order to show his talents, right? He can do that without going into full blood and gore mode, but and he seems like he's trying to do that here. I get this feeling that he is, but it's not quite there for me. Other things that I think, and we're going to get into this later, but I feel like the multiverse concept is really being used up to this point. And this may be just a Marvel thing, but it's just kind of being used as a plot gimmick. And I'm also not completely sold on the whole magic thing, but that's my problem in general with Doctor Strange and with Scarlet Witch, is the way that they use the magic powers. And that's something we'll get into later. There's certain points of the story where it felt like they were using the multiverse idea to explore character, which they're supposed to be doing, right? We've talked about that. I've had some videos on that in the Spider-Man video for example, but it felt a whole lot more forced here for me. And then there's the whole business of the MCU look of them. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like MCU movies all look the same.
Yeah.
They have this kind of flat palette. Everything's in crystal clear, deep focus. You really see the contrast here after all of us being inundated with millions of Marvel movies, and then suddenly the Batman comes out and its style is completely different.
Oh, amazing.
And also really unique and powerful. The way that they use focus and dirty lenses and all of that stuff to get you into the situation, like to pull you into the scene with the Penguin or whoever it is. And then when you come back and you see this and it's the same old Marvel shtick, it's kind of like, okay. I mean, it looks nice, but there's a distance, right? It distances you from what's going on.
Well, in coming from what you said in terms of coming at this from a very kind of psychiatric and psychological perspective, right?
Yeah.
The camera, the visuals, everything that is in front of you is really, it's almost like hypnotism. It is going to, kind of pull you in. And having this very blanketed, I don't want to call it sterile, because
it's not that bad, right? Yeah.
It's not that bad. But like, I completely agree where the Batman kind of draws you into that aesthetic, and it really does play onto, where the emotions are. What is the resonance for the audience? Whereas these Marvel movies are kind of cut and paste, and I think they are really like, okay, the broader story is well, I think Doctor Strange 2 was a very, it was well done in that it was like an isolated story, maybe. But yeah. Well, but the second one too, I mean, it really didn't have a whole lot of, it might have been alluding to like these broader repercussions in the greater Marvel universe. But it it definitely was a cut and paste of what we've just seen over and over again. So Marvel has this tendency to say, okay, we have this broad story, this elongated, multi-decade, right, story that's going to play out, but it compromises the creativity that might be brought to the table by a certain director or certain actors and actresses, writers, producers, everybody.
Yeah, I think the Phase 4 Marvel universe it feels kind of disjointed in comparison with the whole Thanos arc. And once again, it's the villain that does it. And there's no clear villain here in this. And any of these multiverse stories so far, we've just got this vague idea that the multiverse is this big thing and we don't know much about it and it's mysterious. Okay, so what? Right? Whereas before we had half the entire universe is going to get cacked by this crazy guy, right? So it was easier to see what were the stakes, what is the goal, what are the opposite, I can't talk today, opposing forces at work. And that hasn't emerged here yet. Maybe it will in time. And I'm definitely on board for more of this stuff. I do like it enough. I've always been a comic book guy.
Yeah, me too.
But and part of my bias is I've always been a DC guy. But that's a different discussion. I have always enjoyed Marvel too, though. I did want to talk about there's one scene kind of fairly early on that I was just absolutely amazing. And that was when he's just blasting through universe after universe after universe with America. And they even go through this part where they're paint creatures and they're in animation and all that. I'm like, oh man, this is amazing. I can't wait to see where this goes. And it didn't really go anywhere. And I was kind of disappointed by that because I felt like he blew the doors open on this whole multiverse idea. And I'm like, finally, they're going to get into this. And even the title of the movie, right? The Multiverse of Madness. We're just going to go completely bonkers with this. And I was down for that. And part of my disappointment initially was that was what I was expecting going in from the hype and from the title and from the previews and all this stuff. We're going to go into all kinds of weirdness and Sam Raimi is in it, right? So how can this go wrong?
Right.
But it was just all so muted and restrained. Now, part of that is because my expectation, right? And we can't help but do this. We go into a movie with expectations, and if it doesn't meet them, we can be disappointed. But that's not technically the movie's fault necessarily. You can blame it on the marketing, for example. All right, and so whoever wrote the story and everything else had something else in mind, and it was a lot more. It was a lot more about Wanda's character arc than it was about going completely nuts with the possibilities that are inherent in this multiverse business.
Yeah. Well, I think that also Marvel should maybe tip their hats off to DC in terms of, especially with the Batman, right? Because I think you have audiences now that have grown up with these characters and that are craving something that is very much kind of like, if you're going to call it the Multiverse of Madness, it should be absolutely insane, right?
Yeah. I wanted that.
You should have and even visually, there should be scenes where you're looking at something and you can't fully understand what you're looking at, right? Yes. And I didn't get enough of that kind of visual confusion.
Nowhere near.
And again, I think maybe Marvel needs to understand that the audience is far more well adept to experiencing something and thinking about something while they're experiencing it, instead of just having this, here it is. Again, when I was watching Strange 2, afterwards, I was just this is a lot like Iron Man 2, I got that feeling afterwards, he has this sickness and he has to repair the arc reactor, right? He has to build a new one. And at the end of it, Doctor Strange, his watch is fixed. It's almost like he was dealing with his own poison, so to speak, in terms of all that. So it wasn't an exact kind of comparison, but there was still some elements there that resonated.
And what I always talk about on this channel too is how the fantastical elements are used to depict emotional realities. That's a theme in fantasy. If it's done well, if it's not done well, it doesn't connect.
Yeah.
And here, I think we're kind of in the middle of those two extremes. Like it kind of works, but it kind of doesn't really work either. And part of that is the multiverse idea, where you can go into a completely different universe that has different rules of physics and all that. It's going to be really hard to use that in a way that connects to something small, like getting over the grief of losing your children, or you can't be with the woman that you thought was going to be your wife. Okay, that's very small compared to the multiverse idea, right? I don't know how you would connect those two necessarily. You could potentially use the idea of the multiverse to depict true madness, true insanity. Something like a completely, somebody trying to reconcile what is reality itself, like some people with severe psychosis have to contend with. But I mean, that's not, I don't get to be with my girlfriend. It just doesn't measure up to that. And so it doesn't quite work for me.
Yeah.
The universes themselves and the places where they go, they also didn't really feel like they had put much into it, other than let's just give this one couple of scenes and it looks like New York with lots of fuzzy weird stuff, and oh yeah, they also have free food. Okay, really? That was the best you could come up with?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay, I did love the Bruce Campbell cameo. That was great. But that's just the Sam Raimi thing, right? Trying to push through the Marvel kind of veneer. In some ways, I feel like, so what Marvel does well is they create a fantastical story. It's funny, and it's got some adventure, and it's got heart. And that's what they do well, right? That's their machine that cranks that stuff out, right? And it works for the most part. They're really good at it. And, DC has struggled to try to find something like that. And I'm kind of glad they have. Instead, going with wildly diverse visions of their different characters. So Shazam is really kind of the only DC movie that I can think of off the top of my head that has that feel to it, that Marvel feel. It was really funny. It had a lot of heart to it, and, all that. As opposed to like the Snyderverse and all of that stuff. And plus, this new vision of the Batman and all that. They're very different. They don't connect, but they're not intended to. Okay. But in this world, it's almost like that formula that they're trying to use again, because it does work and it's satisfying to people. They like it. I can't blame them for that. But it doesn't quite fit with this whole business of the multiverse and all of the inherent bonkers stuff that Doctor Strange can do and encounter with his powers. Demons and just all of this wild and crazy stuff. It's got to be, by definition, it's got to be more cerebral. And I think that they did nail that with the first one, at least at the end especially, where he defeated Dormammu with thinking it through and getting him locked into an endless cycle, rather than a great big thing where giant CGI monsters blast each other and with stuff we've seen a billion times.
I think they did a better job with the multiversal stuff in What If, to be honest with you. I think
I haven't seen that, so I'm uninformed when it comes to that part.
In terms of like because it does have to be cerebral. I think you're absolutely right. But I think they did a better job with it. And I think it was more like, if they made What If live action, I think it would have been 10 times better.
Okay.
Than Doctor Strange 2. I enjoyed it more, and
because it's one of their big flagship films, though, they felt a little maybe too timid.
Maybe
to go lean full into the whole multiverse idea, which is inherently a lot more cerebral and less part of their let's tell emotional stories with heart.
Well,
there's only so far you can go with that.
But the connection between Doctor Strange in What If and what his story arc was in terms of, and we're talking about love versus possession.
Yeah.
In What If, it was a rendition of Doctor Strange who he literally would just, universe after universe, he could just consume as much sacred knowledge as he could in order for him to have Christine, right? And it got him to a point where he destroyed his universe, right? And they kind of alluded to that a little bit in Multiverse of Madness, but it was so much better, right? You had that kind of that grief and that anger and that kind of yearning, that possession, and that really transferred over into the kind of the broady multiversal issue. Okay. And the way they connected it again in a cartoon was a lot better than they did in this film.
All right. Well, maybe I'll have to check that out. Because that was what I was missing here. If you're going to have fantastical elements to a story, that's great, and you should go for that. But I think any story is going to have believable motivations and characters. It does not matter if it's fantasy or science fiction or a real kind of gritty, down-to-earth drama. Mm-hmm. And in those stories, it's essential, because that's what carries the story, and they typically are very good in a like a heavy drama that's very grounded. In fantasy, I think sometimes they try to substitute real character work with just fantasy lights and bells, and because it can be distracting, and it can kind of work. I mean, just look how popular the 1989 Batman and Batman Returns and those movies. They were very popular, but they had really nothing going on dramatically with the characters. It was just weirdness, just a lot of weirdness and a lot of aesthetic, and that's great, but it's nothing like the newer ones. Like when Nolan showed up and did his version of Batman, it was about Batman. It was about Bruce Wayne and his transformation and all that jazz. And then Matt Reeves has done the same kind of thing. Here, I was missing that in the sense that I felt like they were trying to sell me this idea that Doctor Strange had this character flaw and that he was, really, really bent out of shape over losing his girlfriend. But then at the end, the watch is fixed and everything's great. And I'm like, okay, but I don't really believe that. Yeah. I'm sorry. I just didn't buy that as requiring this massive level of, imagistic storytelling to justify. But if what you're saying is true about the What If series, it sounds like they probably tied it together better. Yeah. The only way to do that is to make Doctor Strange a much more complex character than he is in this movie.
Yeah.
Because then only somebody who is really kind of completely unstable is going to go to that length over, a breakup. A girlfriend broke up with him, and okay, come on, give me a break, dude.
I know.
You got all this immense power. You're a real handsome guy, right? Benedict Cumberbatch, right?
Move on.
Move on, right? Come on, give me a break. This is ridiculous.
Fish in the sea. Yeah.
Right. But if he's a little bit off up here, right, which it could very well be, as being a sorcerer and having to encounter dimensional beings and all this stuff. Okay, so it may have worked better there, but it doesn't. I couldn't buy it here, and I also had the same problem with Wanda. Mm-hmm. Now I liked WandaVision, but at the same time, I really feel like they let her off the hook a little bit too much at the end for what she did. Mm-hmm. It's like they did work it to where you could understand where she was coming from and longing for family and grieving the loss of Vision and all that stuff. But then it's sort of like, well, you made it all right in the end. And I'm like, did she? It's so these characters, they needed more complexity. They needed to dive more into their flaws.
Yeah.
For it to be more believable that she would go then in this movie here to such incredible lengths to acquire her children, right? So maybe the problem isn't that it isn't the theme, it's that it was not quite handled like it maybe should have. They didn't go far enough, and that's maybe part of that whole Marvel timidness. I don't want to try anything really radically different from this formula that's making us bazillions of dollars. I can dig that, but as far as like enjoying the movie, it pulls me out.
Yeah, well, I think, again, they have an audience that is probably
it's almost automatic.
Yeah, it's you have an audience that is just, well, you have two things. You have people that are going to go see these movies, and then on the other hand, you have actual fans and people like us who are kind of trying to digest these, but understanding and observing kind of the superficiality of it. And I don't think I don't think these characters are flushed out enough. When that watch was repaired at the end, I was just like, okay. I thought Wanda definitely had a more, it was definitely more fleshed out for her. Excuse me. It was definitely more fleshed out for her than it was for Strange. But even her ending in this film, I just, there was something about it. I was like, that just seems so unsatisfying.
Yeah. Part of the problem, and we'll get into this a little bit later here, is the fantastical elements of the story are getting to the point where they're starting to interfere with the story itself. And what I mean is, in order for a story to be engaging and interesting, I think you need to have some tension. You have to have narrative tension. And once you introduce the idea of a multiverse, where there's multiple versions of yourself out there, you can do a lot with that, but it comes at a cost, right? Every storytelling decision, a story is like a house of cards, right? You've got to be very careful because one tiny piece can ruin the whole thing. And I think they're running into this problem here with this new wave of MCU movies, because now when a character dies, it's like, yeah, okay. I mean, I already felt that way before, because I'm like, oh, they're going to go back in time and they're going to bring all these characters back. Doctor Strange is not gone forever. Neither is Spider-Man. Don't try to sell me this baloney. And it was with the time travel thing.
Yeah.
But now they've got this, and they've blown the whole door open with this multiverse business. And like you said, at the end, Wanda kills herself to destroy the Darkhold. But there's still countless Wandas out there. So what really happened?
Yeah.
And I've watched some bunch of videos that talk about, here's the explanation behind this plot hole, and here's the, because I like listening to that kind of stuff. It's fun. But I shouldn't have to know all that stuff going in, right? If they're going to do this kind of thing, they've got to make it plausible, right? I don't mean explain every last little thing in there. And I think different viewers have a different tolerance for this. I have a pretty high tolerance for unexplained crap happening in a story. I can fill it in myself, right? I use my own imagination. This one went beyond the limit for me. And this is me, I got to the point where I'm like, okay. And when I start asking questions, I know I'm in a bad location, right? Like asking my question, okay, who is this father of these kids? Where the heck is Vision?
Yeah.
Or the other infinite numbers of Visions out there? Why isn't she able to just kind of reconnect with that guy?
Right.
Or why is she trying to kill America? Why can't she just go up to him and say, I'll pay you $150,000. I'll conjure it up out of thin. I don't know. What do you want, you kid?
Well, there's got to be a universe where, like, maybe Wanda had the children, but then she passed away.
But then she died, right?
Yeah,
that's
there's got to be something out there. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of plot holes. Now,
I have a really good friend who's like steeped in comic book lore, and he has kind of helped me sort through some of these, but I shouldn't be asking myself these questions, right? The filmmakers should make it at least feel consistent enough to where I'm not asking myself that. If I'm asking that stuff myself, I'm disengaged from the story. And so the real problem isn't these so-called plot holes.
Yeah.
We just finished up Beowulf. Beowulf has plot holes too. It's just a part of storytelling. You run into this. But nobody cares. If it's a good enough story, nobody cares. Right? Star Wars has lots of plot holes. Nobody cares because the story brings you in, right? And you're just along for the ride. So yeah. Now, another thing. All right, so let's move on to the next theme. So we talked a little bit about love versus possession. I like that aspect of it.
Yeah.
I don't feel like it was executed to the utmost that it could have. And it sounds to me like we're coming to an agreement on why. It's because they didn't take it far enough. They didn't show these characters as having such an intense dark side that it would be believable they would go to these lengths to possess that which they love. If we were to show it a better example of this, I would say the Star Wars prequels. So Anakin's fall to the dark side is a lot more believable, particularly when you include the Clone Wars series in there and the additional development they did there. That was a whole lot more believable. And it also felt impactful and like something really happened that can't be reversed.
Right.
In this new universe, the rules are still very hazy, and it seems like whatever happens in a movie can just be reversed in the next movie, and so there's really not a whole lot of tension.
Yeah.
It's hard to keep that up.
Yeah. I think
go ahead.
Yeah, with Strange, you had two things in this movie. If they had done what they did with What If with Strange, it would have been because you had two characters that were. You had Strange on one hand, who was just overly possessed with this idea of being with Christine, like needing to be with Christine. And then you had Wanda, who needed to be with her children, needed these children in her life, right? And couldn't accept the realities of their own world, right? The realities of their lives to the extent where they become possessed by this idea that they can have whatever they want by going somewhere else.
Yeah. And that's a really good theme. Yeah. It's really interesting. It's a common theme in fantastical stories. The idea of power, and once I achieve a certain level of power, the question isn't can I do it, it's should I do it.
I do it, yeah.
Right? And that's a great theme to explore, and this is a perfect venue to do that. But if the character motivations aren't there, they're not believable, it's just not gonna work. And I felt like they were mostly there, but not quite there, right? It could have been, I feel like it could have been better there. The other theme was, are you happy? The question they keep asking Dr. Strange. That was an interesting question. I feel like they just sort of threw it in there, and maybe it's just because I missed what they were going for with that, constantly asking him that.
Yeah.
And maybe it was related to the fact that he has all this immense magic power, and that's what I took away from it, was they were asking him this, like, okay, you've got all this magic power, you can do almost anything you want, but are you happy? It's a cool question to ask.
Yeah, I think. Well, I think it connects with the whole "Are you happy?" And he at the beginning he's at Christine's wedding, and he's like, "Oh yeah, no, I'm happy." And he's just like, "Well, the one thing he wants." And again, if they had flushed this out, I feel like it could have been so much better. It's, I think, a common trope and something to be said that the one thing he wants is very simple. He wants this relationship, right? He wants to relate and be with this woman. And he has all this immense power. He has all the gifts I mean, he's not currently the Sorcerer Supreme, but he has all the gifts of the most powerful sorcerer on the planet, right? He's a superhero. He has acclaim. He has fame. He has all of it. But the one thing he wants, he can't have. And I think that was the theme throughout it. Are you happy? Are you happy? Like, you have all these gifts, but even if you do have all these gifts, is it really making you happy? Or is the one thing that you want more grounded in the fact that you just want to relate to the woman? I like that, but again, they could have done a whole lot better.
Well, it just felt very underdeveloped to me. Like they just posed the question and they kind of half-heartedly answered at the end, right before they plunge him into the next adventure, you know, with the third eye and all that stuff. And you've caused a rift in the cosmos, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, so what was the point of all that, right? So
to finish the watch, it was the watch. That's it. That at the end,
that was the symbol.
That's it.
Yeah, it's broken. Now it's not broken. Yeah, it's okay. I get that. Thank you, movie. I really appreciate
it's the acceptance. Like at the end, like he accepts that he can't be with her. Right? Wanda couldn't accept that she couldn't be with her children.
Right.
Yeah.
That seemed to be what they were shooting for, was if you can't have what you want, you have to accept it. Even if you are a stupendously powerful wizard, you can't have everything you want. Okay, that's cool. You know, that's a great lesson, but I mean, couldn't you do more with that than just that? You know, I mean, and how does that connect to the multiverse? How does it connect to the other elements of the story?
Yeah.
It was kind of flimsy to me. It felt kind of flimsily thrown together. You know, it's bringing up the subject of happiness. I mean, that's my business, right? One of my colleagues here likes to say that we're in the misery business, being a psychiatrist, you know, and it is kind of true, but there's a I think a very fundamental fact to what we do, which is we have to recognize that the function or the meaning of life is not about happiness, really. Because, and the reason I say this, even though our culture is constantly inundating us with do whatever makes you happy, right? Because that's really the only thing that matters, is you being happy. No, it isn't. Because number one, perfect happiness is impossible. That's number one problem with that, which this movie does address that, right? Even if you've got stupendous magic, there's some things you're just not going to be able to get. Great. But then there's another lesson, a deeper lesson here, which is that happiness isn't really the goal anyway. It's meaning. Meaningfulness is much more important than happiness. This is Dr. Goodwin's philosophy, okay? But it's not really mine, all right? There's others came before me, like Viktor Frankl, for example, who've talked about this. The brain is not a happiness machine. It's a meaning-making machine. And we are at our most content when we feel like we're living life in a meaningful manner. And by that, I don't mean endless navel gazing, right? I mean, we feel like we're a part of something larger than who we are ourselves, right? That was all that business about Beowulf was about in that series, was showing he didn't win. The Geats were just decimated. He doesn't even get the girl at the end, whoever she was supposed to be, right? The poet didn't bother to mention that, but it doesn't matter because he achieved meaning. He was the greatest king. He was the most kind. He was the most courteous, blah, 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 all that stuff. But I think the real proof of the statement that meaning is more important than happiness is that I can tolerate suffering if I feel that there's a meaning to it, right? I cannot tolerate meaninglessness. I just can't. That's what gets my patients the most distressed, and what I've felt distressed in my own life before. If I don't feel like what I'm doing is meaningful, I'm unhappy. I'm a miserable person. So meaning is prior to happiness.
Yeah.
And the absence of suffering is not going to make you happy, right? In fact, suffering, if it feels like it's meaningless suffering, that's when it's the most painful. But if I feel like there's some purpose behind it, right, then I can endure it. So they raised the question, and I was like, oh, this is a great theme. I want to hear what they have to say about this. And they didn't go anywhere with it.
Yeah.
You know, and again, that's partially my fault for expecting that high level of cerebral engagement in a Marvel movie. You know, maybe I'm expecting too much. But that's where my brain goes immediately when I, hear that "Are you happy?" business.
Yeah.
And at the end, it is pretty much the lesson that is conveyed, that he says, he does seem content. I don't feel like that justified blasting through hundreds of universes, to really convey that. It's like, okay. And the thing that he was struggling with was, you don't get to be with your girlfriend. Big freaking deal. I mean, come on. If they've been together for 20 years or something, and he watched her die and he couldn't stop it, I don't know, you gotta have to crank it up a lot more for it to justify all the stuff that they were connecting it to. At least I felt like Wanda's arc was more believable for me. Yeah. And so, but that had this strange effect of making this more of a Wanda movie than a Doctor Strange movie, because her arc was more impactful, even if it still itself wasn't quite as developed as it could have been.
Right.
It still wasn't quite there. And it does make me wonder. I've seen some videos where they talk about how there was a lot of reshoots for this movie, and a lot of, who knows, right? Fiddling from the studio, probably. But it's just speculation. But it does make me wonder if the Raimi cut, if there's such a thing, and what would that have looked like, and because I'm sorry, but zombie Doctor Strange is just not enough to justify bringing Sam Raimi in to this. It's definitely got his, that's a thing that he would do.
Again, like we also have to, these are studios, they want to make money, right? A name means a lot.
Yeah.
A name means a lot. But the kind of the through line of "Are you happy?" and all of that. I do the same thing. It just goes to the plate, like that place. And I think that if the writers, the producers, even Sam Raimi, the actors had a better understanding of what we're talking about, of happiness and what alignment with oneself means, and
Mm-hmm.
navigating complexes and all that, right? Then a better story would have potentially unfolded.
Oh yeah.
As you were talking, I was like, yeah, this could have been done in two films that kind of built up these expectations about life, these expectations about being with someone, these expectations around love and possession, and then had that follow through. And it reminds me of like Game of Thrones season 8, right? There was this Wanda went from being an Avenger to being possessed and a villain, right? Very quickly.
Overnight.
And those morals, those ethics, like her internal compass of being a good person, a good superhero, just out the door. Like,
Yeah.
I'm going to kill this girl in order for me to go to another universe and then kill potentially another version of me to be with my children who don't exist really in my universe. Right?
Yes.
Like they didn't draw out the Darkhold. They didn't really kind of get into all that. And if they did, it would have been a better film.
Exactly, because and what I've heard as an explanation for that is that most of that was the Darkhold, and they do sort of throw that out there in the movie, but it's kind of a toss away, and you can't get it. You're just not going to be able to get away with that. You can do that in comic books. They do that stuff all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, suddenly they're evil because this magic item, right? But in comic books, you have a different attitude going into it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't escape from that. You can't escape from the fact I'm going to the comic book. I expect absurd crap to be thrown at me, and I'm just going to go with it. I'm just okay with it. I just roll with it. But when you go to a movie, even if it's a comic book movie, the expectations are higher.
Yeah.
Right? This is one of the highest forms of entertainment that we engage in our society now in modern times. You can't get away with throwing that stuff out there and everybody really buying into it. I think a lot of folks probably would just sort of roll with it, But if we're looking at this as what might this have looked like if they had really developed the idea of the Darkhold and said, and from what I understand, it was created by this ancient demon, and he's like even more powerful than Thanos, of course, and so forth, right? And that's all cool. But where is that in this movie? Nowhere. It's just this evil book, and then later on, it's actually stuff written into the wall, and it just seemed like it was out of nowhere.
And then something I wanted to ask you about, actually, and something that we didn't talk about prior to deciding to have this review or this conversation was, for me, the expectation was, especially as soon as they brought in how when you dream, you're dreaming about a different version of yourself, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
As soon as they mentioned that, I was just like, okay, as a comic book fan, I was like, all right, Nightmare, right, is definitely the villain. Nightmare is definitely going to be appearing in this film. And that never happened.
Right.
So maybe it was a false expectation on my part, but they could have done a lot with that, especially in terms of dreams. Like, what was the true corrupting factor in terms of Wanda's myth, and mentioning that and really digging into that. And maybe they should have kind of expressed more of a level of internal conflict between what was Wanda and her, you could call it the good side of Wanda, and then this kind of corrupting factor that was pulling her towards this possession of this murderous possession. You know what I mean? Yeah.
It was just out of nowhere, and it seemed like they did it just for a cool plot twist.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Wanda for help because she's a good guy. She's an Avenger. Oh, nope. She's a bad guy. She's the main villain throwing monsters at this kid who doesn't know what the heck's going on. That was, yeah. So this kind of, I don't know. I guess this kind of leads us into the challenges of fantastical storytelling that I talk about frequently, but this really applies to this movie and to the other Doctor Strange movie too. As I've mentioned many times, the reason for using fantastical story elements is to be able to tell a symbolic story, right? So there's a lot of heavy symbolism in Star Wars, and yet a lot of people mistake that as a sci-fi film, but it's not. None of those are. They're myths. They're dreamlike, and that the stories are symbolically representative of emotional challenges and struggles. And they're really good at depicting those things because you're not constrained by the laws of physics or reality. You can go with pure imagination, just like dreams do. That's why we dream and why dreams can be bizarre. They feel like they're bizarre because they're depicting things in symbolic manner. They're only bizarre if you take it literally. As soon as you take that lens off, it's no longer bizarre. It makes a great deal of sense. Same thing for fantasy stories, including superhero stories. But there's a huge but here. As soon as you break the rules for the sake of emotional truth, you import with that a number of story challenges that you have to deal with. And there's two major ones, in my opinion. One of them is the verisimilitude of the story. How real does it feel? It doesn't have to be realistic, okay, whatever that means. It has to feel real. It has to be convincing. In order to do that, you need lots of things like consistency and clear motivations and characters. And then the other problem that you can arise when you import this stuff in to tell your story is narrative tension can be damaged. And so this is going to be a problem with any story involving magic.
Yeah.
Now, before I get into what I think magic is, so psychologically, I wanted your thoughts on that. What is that? What does magic mean?
Well, it's the symbolic representation of something, right? Like there's a lot of like follow through in terms of symbolism, and I think that's at the core of this. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the difference between hard magic and soft magic, right?
You're right on that's where I'm heading with this. That's where I'm going.
So the difference between something like Tolkien, right, which is very much like it's hard, it's soft magic but hardcore storytelling. Like he's very detailed. And then something along the lines of maybe like, I don't know, Harry Potter, right? It's hard magic, but then soft storytelling. So you have a lot. I think this film in particular, and the Marvel films in terms of how they handle magic, there's a lot of hard magic, right? But not too much in terms of it being this very bombastic. It's not like Gandalf. He's standing in Bag End and he's towering over Bilbo, right? It's a lot different, but you're also missing a lot of explication. You're missing a lot of detail that might, and I think in this case might be necessary or is necessary. Yeah.
You're thinking along the same lines that I am here. For me, I think magic represents the ability of the will to accomplish what it wants. Okay, so in a dream, for example, if you have a dream of someone who is using like magical abilities, what I think of as somebody who I typically see that in people who have they rely heavily on their intellect and they rely heavily on their conscious capacities for thought and working things out. They are either really highly developed feeling types or thinking types, for example. And that will be symbolized as magic in a dream because they can do stuff that a lot of people can't do. They're able to work things out. They can solve problems. They can do math. They can do all this stuff, right? It's like magic. But in a story like this, we're taking these characters and we're saying these are people who can accomplish mental feats beyond what a lot of people can. They're exceptional in that way. And Doctor Strange certainly meets the criteria for that. And Wanda, of course, too. And of course, what that means is they a lot of times will have power complexes. And it's something Jung talks about, actually. Especially if they're introverted by nature and they have a high intellect, they're going to have a power complex because they are aware of the fact that they are able to sort things out and work things out that most people can't in various different specialized areas, right? So then they're going to be possessed by the idea of what am I supposed to do with this, right? How do I fit in? Again, what are they doing? They're trying to find their meaning. How do I fit in? How do I relate to the larger context? And it can be very distressful for them. And a lot of times they put so much into that, they feel like they're worthless otherwise. So they also have a perfectionism complex. Okay. So if you're going to have magic in there, you're going to need to include that kind of stuff in there for it to feel real. And there is some of that in this story. But not enough. Not enough. Okay, now you mentioned hard and soft magic. I thought it would be worthwhile to go through that with, for our 2 or 3 listeners out there. So the way I understand this, just as like a storytelling technique. So a hard magic system means the rules are well defined.
Yep.
And you mentioned Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a great example of a hard magic system. You have to have one. You have to do it as a magic word. You have to do it exactly so, and then poof, the thing happens. A soft magic system is magic happens, and the explanation behind it is vague and kind of hazy. And neither one of these is good or bad, right? They're just different ways of conveying how magic works. But they each come with their own set of challenges and problems. So the advantage of a hard magic system is that you can easily create tension because the rules are clear.
Yep. Right.
I know that with a wave of a hand and saying, Avada Kedavra, that somebody could just be instantly killed because we've seen that happen. We know that that's how the world works in Harry Potter. And so there's a lot of tension there. All it takes is zat, zot, you're dead. And you also mentioned Lord of the Rings. So Lord of the Rings is definitely a soft magic system. Gandalf just sort of does stuff, and we're not sure exactly how he does it and all that. So the benefits and the drawbacks of the different systems is that the hard system, you can have tension, but the cost, however, is in mystery and wonder. Magic should have mystery and wonder behind it. There should be that element too. How am I able to do these things? That's what a lot of those origin stories are about. And that's where the soft magic systems excel, is because they import the magical and the wondrous. But sometimes you can have a cost in terms of tension because, well, if anybody can do anything, then, then how do I show that there's real stakes involved here? Because can't they just magic their way out of it, And so if you don't manage those two counterbalances and those counterweights in your story, you're going to run into problems. And I think this is a big problem with Wanda and with Doctor Strange both. What exactly are Wanda's powers anyway? I don't know. She just seems to be able to do whatever the plot needs her to do in the moment. Like when she's wiping out the Illuminati, I had no doubt in my mind that she was going to just mop the floor with all of them because she's magic, right? She can just do it because. and that's my problem with Doctor Strange too, is he waves his, he wiggles his hands and he waves around, and then whatever the plot needs to happen happens. I don't believe it. And so is that a problem because it is a soft magic system? Yes. So the way to fix the soft magic weakness, there's lots of wonder and mystery, and they did capture that a lot in the first movie, especially with Doctor Strange. But after a while, it gets to the point where, you're like, okay, but what are the limits of this? If there's no limits, then I'm bored.
Right.
Now, Tolkien gets away with this because, number one, none of the main characters that we follow, especially the hobbits, have this power anyway. So only supernatural beings like Gandalf and all these characters, or even elves, can really do it. So when they do it, it's wow. It's really cool. But I can't just do it whenever I feel like it.
Right.
Unlike in the movies, Gandalf can't just conjure up eagles whenever he feels like it.
Right.
Which he doesn't technically do in the books, but never mind. It's so awesome. Who cares, right? But anyway, you get the feeling, right? He conveys to you without revealing all the mysteries of magic that there are limits to it, that it can't just do whatever. And so it's easy to buy into without sacrificing the wonder and the mystery of it. That's how Tolkien does it. Not to mention, his world is so extremely consistent internally. I mean, it amazes me every time I read it how far he went to make sure everything worked exactly in accordance with everything else. So like when they're wandering across the wilderness and they see a flash way off in the distance at this particular time, they have no idea what's going on. But then later it gets explained, oh, Gandalf was over there doing that, right? Right. Or they see a ring wraith flies over them, they have no idea what it means. And then later you find out it was because there was a messenger sent to Sauron from Sauron at that exact time. And it's all perfectly, consistent. Everything is very consistent. I think he must have had it all planned out and plotted. And then he told the story from the bird's eye view, or not from the bird's eye, but from the ground level.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's the kind of thing you have to do if you're going to have a really soft magic system like that to work.
Right.
Everything else in your universe is highly consistent and highly detailed. And then the magic, when it does appear, it's more magical. It's more wondrous. In here, in this movie, and in kind of a lot of these Marvel movies that involve magic, a magic using character shows up, and then whatever happens just sort of happens. And okay, it's just okay, whatever. You have to go with it. You have to accept it.
We're missing the details. We're missing the why.
Yes.
We're missing the meaning. We're missing the kind of what is the kind of the limitations of this magic, right? What's the difference between a witch and a sorcerer? Why is there a difference?
Yeah. At one point, Wong says, "This is a magic. This is witchcraft."
Yeah. What's the difference?
What's the difference there, Wong?
Yeah.
Sorcerer Supreme, want to let the rest of us in on this? Because otherwise, I ain't buying it.
Yeah. I mean, I think in Doctor Strange, to talk about it, it's like energy from a different reality. But what exactly is that? Where are the limitations?
Yeah. She just erases one character's mouth.
Yeah.
She's never done that before. What is that? What kind of magic is that? Right. But before, it was at least sort of telekinetic stuff, and I can make you dream stuff like she did in the Avengers. It just seems like she waves her hands and red stuff appears, and whatever happens, and you just got to go with it. There's no rhyme or reason to it. When she comes and attacks the group where all the sorcerers are, I forget the name of it. I'm like, she's going to mop the floor with all of them. And exactly that's what happened. Nothing they could do would affect her. Not because I knew what her powers were or how powerful she was necessarily. It's just because I knew that was what had to happen at this stage in the story. And I shouldn't be thinking that. I shouldn't be thinking like that. I shouldn't be pulled out of the story like that. And if I can, Harry Potter did this really well by having the rules so strict. And we'll probably talk about this when we get into the Secrets of Dumbledore, which I want to talk about too. But Rowling was very consistent in her world too about that. She was able to maintain some of that awe and wonder, but it wasn't because of the way Tolkien did it. It was because she was telling the story through the eyes of a child who had never encountered any of this stuff before. Mm. Right. And then when all the rules were established, she used that to tell what was essentially a mystery, like almost a detective story, like Scooby-Doo kind of story. Right. Who's trying to steal the Sorcerer's Stone and all that kind of jazz, or Philosopher's Stone, technically. So, yeah, it's funny that you use those two examples. That's what I have in my notes here. Great examples.
It's the first thing I thought of, and again, I think Marvel can take a page out of the book of these writers who have, and authors and storytellers who have done it hundreds of times before, but so much better. In terms of not only, if you're going to incorporate such visually magnificent, right, magic in a story, at the very least, give the audience the courtesy of really getting more detailed in terms of what the story actually is and what these kind of magical elements are, because that's what really we crave. And I think that's why more and more people turn back to these stories, these books and the films. So the Lord of the Rings, even The Hobbit to a certain extent, Harry Potter, these magical elements that were just done right.
Yeah,
done right.
Yeah, and I think it might be one of the reasons why people return to Batman so much, because he does not have any magic powers. He can't BS his way out of problems. Now, technically, he kind of does.
Yeah,
he kind of does, and especially if you like, Roger Ebert, when he was reviewing Batman Begins, he was talking about how it's not realistic, but it thinks it is. And that's effective. For him, that was, he gave it a 4-star review. And he does stuff in that movie too, in Batman Begins, that is near magical. Like he's beating up all these guys, and we're following Falcone until he gets into his car, and all of a sudden Batman's on top of the car. I'm like, wait, how did he get over there? Right? I thought he was way over here. He just sort of teleported there. Well, you know what? He's Batman.
He's Batman. Yeah.
But it's very contained to that kind of stuff, right? You can kind of, it's like sleight of hand.
Yeah. The most recent Batman film, when he's escaping the GCPD, right? And he like pulls down on these straps, and then all of a sudden he has a squirrel suit and he flies down and he's navigating through the streets of Gotham. He pulls the parachute and then it gets caught on a bridge and he literally just smashes into the bus, then a car, then the street, and then rolls over. And I'm like, this guy's dead. Like, there's no way.
No, he gets up and shakes it off.
He's just like, oh, I'm limp. He limps back, and then the next scene, he's absolutely fine. Like he's totally fine. And I'm just like, yeah, that's Batman. That's Batman. That's the magic of Batman.
Yeah,
but
it's very understated, and it's like I said, they use sleight of hand to get it across.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why Nolan, the Nolan trilogy. Again, we go back to it, but at the heart of it was a very psychologically resonant story.
Yeah,
that had these, you call them fantastical, but very, very action-packed imagery, the story that was unfolding. But at the heart of it was something that was very real. And there was a through line between what was at the core of Bruce Wayne's story and then the action that you were seeing, right? Mm-hmm. It was never just arbitrary. It was very, very much kind of succinct and synchronized. Yeah. But
I think. Go ahead.
No, again, but with Marvel, it's like, what do we like? We want to be emotionally invested. Mm-hmm. We want to be, and I think that's real for a lot of the viewers. We want to be emotionally invested. We want to feel entranced. We want to feel like we're in it, but it just doesn't do you justice.
Yeah, and in a fantastical story, I think there's an inverse relationship between how invested you are in the characters and their motivations and their arcs, and how much BS you can get away with when it comes to magic. The more investing the characters are, the more you can get away with shenanigans when it comes to that. And that's kind of what I was feeling with this one, is if I'd have been a little bit more, if I'd really believed in Strange's story more, then it would be easier for me to accept the mushy, loosey-goosey magic system, because it would be more dreamlike, right? Dreams are always about intense emotional challenges. If you're going through them, they're going to depict them in a dream. And the lapses in reality and, breaking the laws of physics and all that kind of stuff don't matter because of the emotional truth of them. So if you don't have an emotionally true arc, then the magical elements are going to feel arbitrary and tacked on and just randomly cooked up off the top of your head, which is a little bit of what I got with this movie. And I know I've been pretty down on this movie, but I had a lot of fun with it. I do want to say that. And I don't want to be overly negative on MCU movies either, because they are doing something, let's be honest here, no one has ever tried to do. To interconnect so many movies is completely unheard of.
Yeah.
And they're doing a pretty decent job of it, but this latest phase is running the risk of becoming so wildly disjointed that it's not going to have anything to connect it other than just, watching all of this stuff, which I'm sure they want you to do. But I got a sense that they probably, at the core, the storytellers want more than just that.
Yeah.
I feel like they are trying to tell something, a meaningful story.
Yeah.
I'll give them the benefit of the doubt anyway, not just after books,
And what I'm about to say, I don't mean it in a negative way, but I think that it just goes to show that if you are, let's say, somebody who, I don't want to say has an overinvestment into fantasy, but somebody who uses fantasy material, like I was an individual who did this, that put a lot of, kind of my own libido into fantasy material. Mm-hmm. And those people that are really using it as a surrogate for actual lived experience, when you watch something that's emotionally resonant, even if it is like this grand story, you are going to get some level of satisfaction out of it, even though it might be suboptimal, right? You're going to get some level of satisfaction out of it because it's resonant with you on a level where you probably should invest why you're so kind of invested in.
Right. It's worth exploring. Yes.
Right. You should explore that. But I think people are catching on. They're saying that there is no emotional investment here, or at the very least, it's fleeting. It's not. There isn't
Seems half-heartedly done.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. All right. Well, that's our analysis.
That's it.
Verdict. My final verdict. I'll say what my thoughts are, and I'll let you go. I feel like the fantasy elements were not quite as inspired as they could have been. They felt a little bit unconvincing and a little bit arbitrary in points. That's my drawback, negatives. But on the positive side, it was very, very visually interesting. Mm-hmm. Particularly certain elements of it were really cool, and just sparked the imagination. I like that, and the acting was top notch. Both Olsen and Cumberbatch were on their A game, I think. The material they had to work with was really more the drawback. They had to pour their heart and soul into this stuff that is by nature not all that tremendously convincing, and they did their best with it. They are very good actors. I've not seen Olsen in anything else, but I've seen Cumberbatch play Shakespeare, and I mean the guy's phenomenal. So there is a lot of fun with all the tie-ins. I still find that fun. Yeah. Even though it's kind of just fan service and kind of, find all the Easter eggs and all that kind of thing. Yeah. My inner 10-year-old likes that kind of stuff. But at the same time, it's all, I worry, and I'm not the only person out here that worries that they're relying a little bit too much on that these days now. And the emergence of a movie like The Batman is showing us that none of that stuff is necessary at all to tell a great story. It's fun, sure, and I imagine he'll probably do this with the sequels. And Reeves included a ton of stuff from Batman lore in his movies, but it's not necessary to see that to really be really drawn in to the story. Yeah, he doesn't lean on it. It's just there in the background for fun. So. Yeah, but what is your final thoughts on it?
6.5 out of 10 for me. And like you said, I thought it was visually great. I liked it. The hook for me was the director, even though it wasn't fully within his style, right? He wasn't given that kind of creative liberty. Yeah. And I think the one thing that really stuck out for me was that, I think the reason why it's a 6.5 out of 10 for me, aside from like the rest of like what Marvel has been putting out, is because the rest of what Marvel has been putting out for me has not been great.
It's not been all that great. Yeah.
No. Okay. So yeah, that's where it's at for me.
Okay. Yeah. And in fact, you mentioned Raimi. I just remembered that I got a lot of the same feeling out of this movie that I did with Spider-Man 3. Which the internet hates Spider-Man 3. I don't really think it's all that bad. But you can definitely see that Raimi was stifled. He wanted to make 2 more movies, or at least if he didn't want to throw Venom in there, which was just shoehorned in there, obviously. And it wound up with the movie being completely overstuffed and just all that. But it's still, I still am amazed at how coherent it actually still is, despite all of that. And I still had a lot of fun with that movie.
The greatest gift of Spider-Man 3 is the memes for me.
Yes.
It's all the best memes.
Yeah.
Just the dancing evil Tobey Maguire like that.
Emo Maguire.
Emo Maguire. Yeah. It's so good. It's so good.
Yeah. On that note, we'll wrap up things for today. So
thanks, Dr. Gwynn. I'll see you later.
All right. We'll see you.
Bye.